tricky while running everything else.
We're up.
Just do 5 minutes.
Can you slow down where the chat
Oh, right.
Yeah,
on the
so
off chance that someone is watching? I'm gonna wait out.
yeah, let's see here. So if we just go to this, right, but this is the link. I'll put it on the ICCC's Twitter.
Right.
Yeah, so you can just find it from there.
Okay.
I'm gonna start speaking as soon as I retweet my. Wait, am I not following the?
It's ICCC _conf.
Many people.
That's
Maybe I just see your.
Here, there.
Okay. Huh. Yeah, I just go to. Okay. We're just delayed by about 15 seconds. Good.
Yep.
Perfect.
That's in case somebody says a swear. I can.
Right, because I care so much.
You know that we've got like a Trump tweet simulator.
Yeah, that should be good.
Yeah, it's
All right. Yep, we are.
here.
We are all good.
These are our
And there's chat. I see. Thank you. One watching now, which is to say me.
All right.
Okay.
Are we going?
So, welcome everyone. We're glad that you're here. I will keep time. And we're 10 minutes late. Do you want me to just let us start the coffee break at 10:10?
Yeah,
Is
maybe
that-
like
Is that the right strategy?
Okay.
Okay.
Like a half-hour coffee break. It's quite generous.
I thought so. So
Yeah.
20 minutes should be. I mean, and if we make the coffee break a little long, we'll be.
Then we
okay.
just wait for discussion.
Yeah.
We'll be okay.
Okay, so I think what we'll aim for is this is a 75-minute session with 3 talks, so that's 20-minute talks with 5 minutes for questions, and give or take, obviously, and I'm sure we'll be fine. And with that, welcome. We're glad you're here. Jillian and I and Anne Sullivan from University of Central Florida are the co-organizers of this workshop, but a very large part of it is Jillian saying, damn it, we really need to do this, and I'm very grateful for that.
But a huge part of it was Dan messaging me like a year ago saying, hey, we should really do this thing.
So I'm glad that it worked out. So I'm glad that it
We're
worked
all
out.
very glad that it worked out.
Jillian is going to present the first of the 3 talks we have today on computational creativity and social justice, defining the intellectual landscape.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Many of you who I know, and the rest I'm looking forward to getting to know. My name is Jillian Smith. I'm an assistant professor, very, very soon to be at WPI in Boston, Massachusetts. So let's just say that I'm there already now because it's like a week away. I'm going to be talking today about it's a very sort of position-y kind of paper on like what are we really talking about when we talk about computational creativity and social justice. Borrowing heavily from a class that I've taught and work that I've done looking at these issues in games. I want to say there's a lot of material that I'm going to be referencing during this talk. And I'm not sure that I've always been good about crediting it in like small font on slides. So if you're interested in kind of reading along and seeing what I'm talking about, I put all of this stuff kind of informally into a Google document so you can like click links and follow things up. And if I missed something, please let me know and I'm happy to add it at the end. So at CHI this year, so the Human-Computer Interaction Conference, there's an alt-CHI track, which is sort of like alternative perspectives on CHI. And at this track, a researcher called Anne White gave this talk on design in existential crisis. It's like, what are we doing? Right? Like the world is changing, and it's changing in really scary ways. There are people who say that we're now living in a new era, right? An era in which human activity is what's going to define what happens to our environment, right? Like we're living in the Anthropocene. And every day I wake up to headlines like this, and I get really scared, and I get really sad. And then I sit down and I make a quilt, and I'm like, God, what am I doing? Right? Like, what am I doing? So a lot of the ideas that I have behind behind this talk are really like, what can we do as computational creativity researchers in the face of this, right? And that's not to say that I don't think it's worthwhile to make beautiful art. I think it's always worthwhile to make beautiful art. That's one of the things we can do, actually. But yeah, other things we can do that are more concrete and more targeted around issues of social justice. So I wanted to start out, and there's going to be a few quotes kind of peppered through the talk around what social justice means, right? And Leanne Bell is a researcher who's talked about social justice in these terms. So she says, social justice is both the process and the goal. The goal of social justice is full and equal participation of all groups in a society that is mutually shaped to meet their needs. So here she's talking about the goal, and she does go on in this piece to talk about what the process is as well. But sort of roughly speaking, what it comes out to is that we are the process, right? Like, we are the people who get to change our society. We are the people who get to move things forward towards justice and equity. So what can we do? And why is it that computational creativity is an interesting space to do work related to social justice, right? So these are all like beautiful art from the Prisma AI phone app, right? Like probably the thing that's popularized computational creativity for the general public. As researchers in this space, we are creating software and creating tools and creating systems that shape the way that the general public perceives creative AI. Right, and sort of we're like the public face of AI in some ways, or we're one of the public faces of AI. And I think it's important to keep in mind as we're doing all of this work that the AI that we're creating and the technologies that we're creating are not neutral. Because I don't happen to know what this is a picture of. Yep. What is it? I just became a teacher, sorry.
Long Island, is it the Long Island Expressway? It's basically on the winner paper, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is one of the bridges that goes over
Yes.
Goes over the main parkway through Long Island. In his paper to Artifacts of Politics, Lyndon Winner talks about these bridges. So these are bridges that were constructed by Robert Moses, or not like literally constructed, but designed by Robert Moses. And there's this sort of contentious history to them, which is these are bridges that are too low for buses to pass under. Right, which makes it so that through the act of constructing a bridge, which on the surface looks like it should be a super helpful thing, right? Like, we like bridges. Bridges help us go places. You're also making commitments and making claims as to how people can use the space, right? And in this case, it was constructed such that buses, which primarily would carry people of color and low-income people through the space, cannot use this road. Right? And we've seen the same thing, I live near Boston, we've seen the same thing with the construction of roads in Boston, where like elaborate one-way systems are constructed and roads don't go where you think roads should go to be able to get places, because we didn't want Black people to be able to use them to get from some neighborhoods to other neighborhoods, so just like there isn't a road there. When we build technology, sometimes we're making intentional commitments like this, but sometimes we're sort of making unintentional commitments. But at all times, we need to be aware of the fact that the technology that we're creating is inherently non-neutral. And this maybe came to the forefront in the most public way possible in the space of creative AI with Microsoft's Tay chatbot, which learns from responses given to the bot, and in the space of like 24 hours, Tay turned from this like cute teenage girl tweeting about things to like a Nazi racist hate monger who would say just like the most unconscionable things possible, and Microsoft had to bring it down. So I mean, that's like an obvious place where technology was non-neutral, but there are also places where technology is non-neutral in sort of more subtle ways. And I know that there's researchers in the computational creativity community who are using like Google's autocomplete to like learn ground truth about the world in some sense, right? So this is what Google thinks that ground truth is about according to like the internet search that I ran in my hotel room last night. So there are all of these ways in which the technologies that we use within creative AI and the technologies that we create ourselves cannot be seen as neutral, and we need to kind of embrace that and accept that and figure out what to do with it. So I think it's clear from these kinds of examples, to me at least, that there's a conversation that we need to be having in the ICCC community that I'm excited to be having in this workshop today, around what is sort of a responsibility, what are the ramifications of creative AI with respect towards issues around social justice. Those conversations are sort of, we have them in like corners of the conference, like they don't tend to come to the forefront. But one place that they have come to the forefront is in games and game studies. So in this talk, I'm going to be kind of comparing the kinds of conversations that we have in games around social justice. Not that things are perfect in that space by any stretch of the imagination, to the kinds of conversations we could be having in the ICCC community. And I want to talk about why it is that I think games and computational creativity have interesting parallels to draw. So games, like computational creativity, they're inherently interdisciplinary. They're an entertainment and creative field that are very highly public-facing. Games much more so than ICCC, but I think computational creativity is going to grow as like we ride this wave of deep learning, for better or worse. And like we ride the wave of Twitter bots, for better or worse. I think public perception of AI is changing in a radical way. We also need to be accountable to an audience in some sense, and we need to be aware of who our audience is. And this is something that we care very deeply about in games, that I think we're sort of just beginning to care about, in at least in my understanding of ICCC work, but it's entirely possible that 20 years ago, people were totally doing this and I'm just stupid. And I think it's also important to think about the fact that both games and ICCC, though we can talk about AI work that happens in this space, these are also areas that are closely related to human-centered computing, right? Like at all times, we're doing things that are related to humans and related to society in our work, whether it's through mimicking a human artist or creating a new kind of thing that creates art for people to look at, or really anything in between. So within games, there are these rich threads of scholarship and practice already around games and social justice, and specifically the kinds of things that people are looking at, the kinds of questions that we're asking, are related to how can we better understand the culture that surrounds games? What is it about certain aspects of game culture that can be very toxic? And what is it about certain aspects of game culture that can be very welcoming and open and diverse, and what makes that happen? We talk a lot about representation in games. Are there queer people of color in games? How many women in games are there, and like, are they wearing reasonable costumes, or are they just wearing bikinis and slaying dragons all the time? We talk a lot about who gets to make games and what is a game anyway, and how can we change it, sort of the demographic makeup of who's making these games. And then we also talk about games for social activism and games as a form of cultural critique. So in the context of all of this research, in the spring of this last year, when I was at Northeastern University, I was fortunate enough to be able to teach an entire course in games and social justice, which was a nice excuse for me to like put together a nice lit review that shows up in the paper. But there were also some really interesting discussions that we had in the class, which was kind of split between students reading and discussing and trying to like get deep into some of the really complicated issues around social justice in their chosen field of study. And then they also went out and partnered with local community partners to make games that were intended to intersect some element of social justice. So I had students who are making playground games for kids who don't have playgrounds. So there's like recess games that you can play while you're in a classroom with tables all over the place, because they don't have an outside space to play in their elementary school. Or a group that was making a game that was about income inequality for a local nonprofit that's trying to address issues of income inequality, and wanted a game that they could have their donors play. So the perspective that I'm kind of coming to this from is one of both a researcher and a practitioner, 3 times also a teacher, right? And how these link together. So let's talk about what social justice looks like in computational creativity. And this quote from Tara McPherson, I think, is one that I keep kind of coming back to in my work when I'm thinking about social justice and computational creativity. I asked what it might mean to design from their very conception digital tools and applications that emerge from the concerns of cultural theory and in particular from a feminist concern of difference. Like, what if we were to take the values behind social justice and the things that we care about in our society and deeply build them into our computational creative systems? Would we make new kinds of systems, right? Or would we make new kinds of algorithms, right? What are the kinds of things that we can care about? So I talked about computational creativity as a human-centered field. I think it's important to think about where and what roles the humans are in computational creativity. So there's kind of both the obvious one and the one that we like to distance ourselves from in this community a little bit, which is that we are the humans in computational creativity. Right, like we create software, and as much as we can sit there and say, like, is my software autonomously created, on some level, like, we were humans who made it. And at best, that software, I think, is like an apprentice who we've trained. But like our values are going to be imbued in the software that we create just as much as my advisor's research goals are imbued into the kind of scholar that I am today, right? Because that's just how it works. So we are the humans in computational creativity. We can also talk about the humans who are depicted in the products created by it. So this is a painting from Simon Colson's painting Fool, that's depicting a human, right? We can talk about the humans who are creating data for us to work from. So these are color palettes created by real-life humans that are uploaded on the Color Lovers website, which is an API that I've used in some of my work. And I think it's important for me to remember when I pull color palettes from this API that like an actual human labored to be able to create it. And that's gone into my work in some way. And then there's the humans who are the audience, right? So Tiny Cities is this like delightful Twitter bot that I love. It brings joy to my day every like 5 hours or so. And apparently 14 people also it brought joy to on this particular tweet, right? So humans are the audience for our work. And we can think about who is engaging with our work and why and how and when. And I am going to stand by the claim that this is computational creative for the record. I don't buy into this mere generation thing. And you can argue with me about that later if you would like. But this is a computational creative system. All right, so let's talk about the different kinds of facets of computational creativity and social justice with respect to where the people are. So this is a screenshot from ConceptNet, which is informing us what a woman is and what she's capable of doing. There's a word under the emoji. I just chose to not have that word be on the slide. So within games, when we talk about representation, we're often talking about the representation of marginalized identities within games. So we talk a lot about who, right? Like who is here, who is present, who is in our games. So Adrienne Shaw has the LGBTQ Game Archive, which is a fantastic sort of repository of like, here's a bunch of games that have queer people in them and how are they represented and when and why, to what extent. This is also work that social scientists like Dimitri Williams and Mia Consalvo have done in building a virtual census, which actually looks at the representation of race, gender, and age, I think, in games, and then compares the representation within the most popular games in the US to the US Census data, right? To say like, where are the imbalances and why? Spoiler alert, there's a lot of imbalances there. But we don't just talk about who, we also talk about how, right? We talk about how people are represented in games, how are people of color represented in games. I think one of the most powerful and awkward and painful and productive conversations we had in my class this last semester was when we were looking at work from Everett and Watkins, I want to say, it's in the Google Doc, who are talking about race performance in games. And they make this really evocative claim that when you're playing a caricatured black character in a game as a white player, is this any different from putting on blackface? Right? Is this really any different from taking on the role of a race, like a caricatured version of a race that is inherently a racist representation, and being willing to like take that on and play it ourselves? So we talk a lot about how are people represented and what does that mean to the player? Like, what does that mean to the audience? What does it mean in terms of the biases that were held by the designers? We also talk about where is identity assumed and what kind of accidents arise from that. So I played Fable once. I was running around wearing a dress. I was flirting with a bunch of characters. I was having a great time. And every so often, one of them would yell from across the screen, "Hey, nice trousers!" Right? And I'm like, where did that bark come from? And clearly, someone wrote this thing that was assuming that I was wearing trousers. I'm not. Well, I am now. But like, my character was not, right? So where are these ideas coming from? So in computational creativity, what does this mean? We can talk about who we depict in the work that our systems create, and whose work gets valued. So for those of us who are doing work with data sets, I think it's interesting to think about what data is not typically represented. Mimi Onoha is a research artist in residence at IBM in New York City. She's been doing this work of pulling together missing data sets. What is the data that we just don't have? And a lot of this, sort of because of her interest and background, turns out to be about race and like violence against trans people. We can talk about who is actually the subject of the work that our systems are creating, and also like what do we think of as suitable domains for computational creativity. There's a long history of bias in the fine arts, right, around like what counts as art, what gets to go into museums, who gets to be seen as an artist, right, and how many of those biases are filtering into the work of computational creativity scholars. I'm not really sure. These are more questions than answers, right? There's work to be done. So another area we can look at is that of algorithmic bias. So within games, we talk about how we're building these computational models of identity and society that can be deeply problematic, as in RimWorld, which somehow ended up defining like all women are bi, but men can only be either straight or gay, and men are attracted to all women older than 20, but women are only attracted to people within like a certain age range of themselves. And this is all like codified, like literally codified in the game's code. Like the ideas of relationships is held by the designer, like funneled down into this thing. You know, what level of commitments are we making as CC researchers in our code around identity and society? And if we're not making formal explicit commitments, what assumed commitments are we making? Or what commitments could we be making? Software requires us when we make it to make these commitments about what do we explicitly want to represent and what do we want to ignore and allow to be implicit. So in computational creativity, I think this starts to look like acknowledging that software gets made by people, and those people are us, and that we need to accept responsibility as the creators of these systems. And we can also have conversations about, like, as creative systems, how should they reason about people in society? Like, as an artist myself, I may not be thinking about race when I make a quilt, but certainly all of my notions of society are like somehow going into my work. But I would imagine that most people's computational creativity systems don't have some representation of like societal context that's going into their creation. The third facet that and I'm intentionally going fast because I'm told that I'm low on time. The third facet that I think is valuable to talk about is that of community. So within games, we tend to talk about how can we reach new communities, how can we build tools that make it so that more people can make games, how do we amplify the diverse voices that exist within games. Ludica was this feminist collective of scholars who wrote this seminal piece on the hegemony of play, which talks about the sort of the canon of games that are taught in schools and that inform design, right? And what are the properties of those games, and like how is what you think of as a real game informing the kind of design work that you do? I think we can have similar conversations in computational creativity. There are tools that are intended to make it so that more people can make games and creative things. I think Tracery from Kate is a really great example of a computational creativity tool that has launched a community surrounding it, right, and empowered people to be able to make things.
Which is largely female and non-binary.
Which is largely female and non-binary, and much the same way as Twine is in the space of games. And then we also have game marketplaces like Itch, which are intentionally open and intentionally easy to publish to. to encourage more people into the space. So I think we need to talk about that in computational creativity as well, right? Like, are we shaping what our community is by our definition of what computational creativity is? I would say yes. And what can we do to try to diversify our community? I look around the main conference and I don't see a lot of people of color. More this year than a couple years ago, but I don't see that many women either. What can we do? Is it about making new tools? Is it about getting our ideas out into new spaces? Is it just about building social awareness within our own community of the fact that we're not terribly diverse? Is it all of these things? Is it none of these things? Well, it's probably not none of these things. Is it something else, right? And then I think the final facet that I want to talk about before I need to wrap up is that of building experiences. And I think this is something that games does a lot of, that I would love to see computational creativity researchers think about. So games are playable experiences, right? Like, they're intended to be played by people. They're designed for an audience. They may be designed for the designer themselves, or they may be designed for the mass market, or they may be designed for something in between. But we use games as a way of critiquing our society and talking about complicated issues. So dysphoria, which is anthropy's sort of personal expression of the experience of being trans and transitioning. Alice and Kev, which is this fantastic story told through The Sims 3 about a homeless family with an abusive father. Papers, Please, which is a wildly popular game which gets us thinking about immigration control. Darfur is Dying, which is a game that was intentionally designed to raise awareness of political conditions in Darfur and the crisis there. I think in computational creativity, we often talk about building systems, right? Like, we make systems and we evaluate them. We don't as often, I think, but sometimes talk about making experiences, like making things that tell stories. But our work is like amazing for being able to tell stories with and build experiences with. And I think this is a conversation that we can be having as well, of what stories can we tell and how and why, and what stories do we want to tell as a community. So I want to close with this quote from Bell Hooks, who's a prominent feminist scholar, around the idea of justice, right? What is justice? The heart of it is really longing for people to be able to grow and develop freely in a positive and constructive way. So what are the conditions that allow for that? What are the conditions within computational creativity that allow for these kinds of values to come through in our work? What can we do to be promoting justice? And you don't need to read all of these questions; they're in the paper. But I think they're a question. The framework that I've been presenting, I hope, can help us come up with what those questions are. And I want to close again with this idea, right? We are one of the public faces of artificial intelligence, whether we like it or not. I think we have a moment now that we can embrace to be able to say, like, hey, we've been around and we've been doing this for a while. We know a lot about AI. AI is popular now. This is what it means to do creative AI, and this is what it can do for our society. And I think all of us, especially because we come largely from academic backgrounds, we have a lot of privileges, regardless of our own personal backgrounds. We carry a lot of privilege through the status of our institution, whether that's globally, and that Georgia Tech is like the #1 research university in technical stuff in some list somewhere, or whether it's small and local, right? Like, I work in a community college, but a lot of kids in my community, but like maybe I do work in a community college, and a lot of kids in my community come to that college, and the fact that I'm a professor there maybe makes a difference to someone in my community. We're all very well-educated people, right? And many of us maybe came up with through this liberal arts model of education. What can we do with that? And for the most part, like, we complain about grants and funding, and it's hard to do the thing, but like, we have a lot of freedom. We're not beholden to a market. We don't need to make things that sell. We have the ability to do what works academically. And what I want to ask you all is, with all of these privileges that we have, how are we going to leverage them towards justice and equity? And thank you.
a little late, but I
Sorry.
really wanted to let Jillian finish her very good speech, her very good talk. Do we have any questions for her before we move on? Please.
I think a lot of this, well, it was for me, one of the big things that I saw yesterday is this concept of universality in ICCC, and I think you touched on this a little bit about, and just thinking like, what would it mean to make personal computational creativity? And I've certainly seen this a lot as well in like the games community of whenever you're talking about universal games, or we saw this yesterday with the general game, we're making a general game playing system or general game creation system, and
What does
for
general mean?
and for some reason it always draws a line around whatever the author played in the 80s.
Yes.
And I've also seen that move made like very sharply to define real games and not real games. And for some reason, the not real games are always made by women, or people of color, or other communities.
Yeah, I think this is, on some level, like we do AI, so we need to tightly define our domain or we're lost, right? Like we can't get around it. I think the question that we need to be asking ourselves, and the question that we need to be like hooking other people in our community with, because I would point out that like most of the community is not in this room right now, which doesn't mean they're not interested. They're just not in this room right now, so they're not having the conversation that we're all about to have. But we have the ability to push the conversation out into the main context as well. So when people talk about generality, it's like general with respect to what, right? Like what is the contextual frame that you're general within? And does it need to be general within that, right? Because saying generality gives us this idea that like it's universally general, but actually it's like 80s retro video games general.
And I've also
or like Museum of Modern Art general.
Whether it should be general, like why do we take that as our sort of abstract goal?
Yeah.
We're going to make the every teenager, or we're going to make the the universal painter.
Yeah. I think we see that when we go to like crowdsourced data sources as well, right? Like, I need ground truth about whatever, right? For my AI system to be able to reason about a thing, I need ground truth about the city of Atlanta. So what is ground truth about the city of Atlanta, right? But it implies an objectivity where there isn't one. And we hide behind objectivity and rationality, right? We're like, oh, well, objectively speaking, Google says that Atlanta is so gay. And therefore, right, like we would never say that. Like we would say that there was a bug. But there are other assumptions that we do make that I think we do say that are not necessarily reasonable to make. Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
I think we should move on. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you.
So it's VGA. Can you easily find
Yes,
that?
yes,
Great.
we finally found
It sometimes amazes me that it's 2017 and this isn't a solved problem. But it's
Don't
If
worry.
computer scientists were working on the problems that people cared about, we would all have working printers.
Yes.
For once, these are the problems that the computer scientists care about.
But actually, as it happens, everyone else might too. If only ...
I'm sure there'll be a newsstand in a couple of years and fix everything.
There you go.
There was, I got a
USB
USB-C.
4.
There you go.
You'll need a dongle to get to it.
Right. And then they'll change the connector.
Yeah.
Great. All right. You good?
I'm just gonna, it's a 4K display, and it's like trying to argue with me why did I put it to VGA.
We will take a moment for. We will take a moment. Are we good?
Yes, I think.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Next talk is about Unpack That Tweet, which is a really clever system that these folks and the co-authors all wrote together based on things in the news, and we'll let them tell you about it.
Hi everyone, good morning. Welcome to Atlanta. Those of you who are not from Atlanta, we built a new highway for you guys. Let me introduce myself. My name is Upal. I'm Chris. And there are 3 of our team members who couldn't be here. And today we're going to talk about a system that we built that helps make the implicit explicit when it comes to tweeting. So without further ado, here's the rough outline of the talk. So we're going to go through some motivation and introduction. I will sort of propose about the consequential nature of the Twitter rhetoric and sort of highlight a current need. We'll describe the system and state the contributions. Then we'll take a deeper dive into the system. We'll actually do a live demo, so let's see how that goes. and then we'll leave with takeaways and implications. So words are really powerful in sort of constructing our social fabric. Rhetoric and communication, specifically from world leaders, have deep and profound impact on the way it shapes our social, cultural, and political landscapes. Understanding this rhetoric and communication in a meaningful way has deep implications for informed civic engagement. Now, these forms of rhetoric and communication has been analyzed in the past through past mediums of speeches, radio speeches, as well as TV speeches. But recently, Twitter has sort of emerged as a legitimate form of communication, for better or worse, where political leaders are using it to sort of communicate to the masses. And what is interesting is these tweets are having real consequences, stock market consequences, social justice consequences, as well as political consequences. In particular, the current US president has chosen Twitter as his preferred form of communication. And what we felt was this, there was a need to have a rigorous understanding of this computational study of these tweets. So we looked at some current systems. So recent attempts, and I'm just highlighting one, we felt were really good on the simulative aspect. So they were really good at simulating the tweet, but we felt they were not necessarily explainable. I couldn't understand where this tweet is coming from, what topics are involved in this tweet, what is this a response to? What kind of strategies have this been used to do it, if any? So we sort of like see this black box or a non-explainable system. So we felt that there was a need to have a clear box system that helps us understand how these tweets are made. Not only does it have to have a good simulative aspect, but it should also have this explainable part. And I'll unpack what I mean by explainable. So we define these notions of interpretability and traceability. And that's what we sort of refer to as unpacking. So for the rest of the talk, that's what we mean by unpacking. So with that in mind, this is what we've built. We have built a system that uses a cognitive model and enables users to simulate what-if tweeting scenarios and unpack each tweet in an explainable manner. And with the explainable nature in mind, here is what we sort of mean by explainable. We feel that the system should just not spit out everything. It should spit the data out in a way that is understandable, is tractable, but also it allows users to inspect through parts of the system. So there's some traceability in it. So here's the use case that we built on. So like we've decided that to basically have a concrete use case for the system, we will model at real Donald Trump. A few caveats here. We're modeling the tweeting behavior, not the person. It is only for this handle, and it's across all devices. And we're trying to simulate new tweets rather than analyze past ones, given a scenario. These are the contributions that we have liked to make. So we think we have proposed an explainable framework that allows users to unpack the decision-making process behind simulated tweets. We sort of add that system, the framework, to a contextual use case, which we think is consequential, basically modeling the tweeting behavior of real Donald Trump. And lastly, but most importantly, we feel that this process can be transferred to model other leaders in the world. So while our system is right now optimized on real Donald Trump, this model can be translated to other people. With this said, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Okay, so I would like to talk for a few minutes about our belief base, which is one of the central components of our system. So we started by looking at the stated summaries, the summaries of stated campaign policies from Donald Trump during his campaign, along with a tweet corpus from real Donald Trump of around 8,000 tweets, which were taken from the real Donald Trump account while he was, after he had announced his candidacy, right up until he was nominated as president. This information is sent to into Bluemix, and Bluemix performs entity extraction and sentiment and emotion detection for us, and these elements together form a belief base. Specifically, a belief in our case is a triple of topics, for example, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Snowy the Apprentice, sentiment, which is a real valued number from -1 to +1, and this notion of emotion, which is comprised of a notion of joy, disgust, sadness, anger, and fear. For our purposes, we have classified joy as a positive emotion, with disgust, sadness, anger, and fear as negative emotions. Another piece of work that we had to, or another piece of information that we needed to construct was this notion of a tweeting strategy. The belief base sort of describes what our agent is thinking, but it doesn't describe how our agent acts or behaves in certain scenarios. So that's where these tweeting strategies come in. We borrow a few a few strategies from George Lakoff's taxonomy of Donald Trump's tweeting behaviors, preemptive framing, diversion, deflection, and trial ballooning. And we've added a few tweeting strategies of our own, self-promotion and mobilization. And these together are the strategies that our system uses to produce tweets. Note that we have validated these strategies by manually coding a sample of Donald Trump's actual tweets. We looked at a few hundred tweets here, and we have manually coded them as one of these strategies, just to ensure that these strategies actually represented, or that these strategies are actually represented in the actual tweet corpus. These strategies together compose our deliberator module, which I will explain shortly. So with that in mind, I will quickly explain the schema of our model. The system begins with a news headline, some headline from the wild. This news headline is fed into a processor module, which parses the text and extracts relevant topics of the news headline. For example, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Celebrity Apprentice. The headline is then sent to an appraiser module, which detects the sentiment and emotion of the headline and assigns sentiment and emotion to each of the topics in the news headline. So for example, the news headline says something negative about Arnold Schwarzenegger. This information is sent to a selector module, which tries to find the most relevant belief in the system's belief base. All of this information is sent to a deliberator module, which looks for the agreement between the news headline and the relevant beliefs in the belief base, and then takes action according to the notion, or how much in agreement the system is with the news headline. The agreement determines which kinds of tweets are generated from set of parameters. Note that these two circled elements here are the only elements that are subject dependent. The belief base and the deliberator required us to pour through data and record information particular to Donald Trump. If you wanted to apply this model to another world leader or another person in general, you would only need to substitute. These two elements. So with that in mind, let's do a quick example. A news headline: "With Schwarzenegger as host, Celebrity Apprentice laughs old buddy," is a real headline. This headline is run through the processor module, and the processor detects Arnold Schwarzenegger as Celebrity Apprentice. This is sent to the appraiser, which detects that this headline is a negative headline, so it has a negative sentiment attached to it, and also has the emotion of disgust attached to it. This information is sent into the selector module, which looks for a belief that is most tightly connected to Arnold Schwarzenegger and Celebrity Apprentice. There is Donald Trump has expressed disgust towards Schwarzenegger and Celebrity Apprentice also. So there's a strong match between what the headline is expressing and what our system believes. Since there's a strong match, our system chooses to produce a tweet using the strategy self-promotion. And our system produces a scathing tweet in response to the headline, where he blasts Arnold Schwarzenegger and Celebrity Apprentice. So those slides talk about the inner workings of our model, but a key trait that we want our system to exhibit is this notion of interpretability, where we want to make these details the nitty-gritty of our system. We want to make that easy for people to understand so that they can reasonably work with it without needing to know the specific mechanisms of how the system works. So with this in mind, I pass control back to Paul. We're in.
All right, let's see.
We do a demo.
All right. All right, so, oh, good Lord, I did not realize the screen would pixelate like this. So on this side, you'll see that these are a bunch of headlines. These are real news headlines. And the demo will be sort of split in two parts. So the first part is this generation of the tweet, which is number 2, right? I can select the headline, and I can hit generate tweet.
So in case you can't see it, it says Trump gets 9 more trademarks approved in China.
Yes, so Trump gets, so it's sort of like a very sort of positive sentiment tweet in the sense that he has succeeded. So as you will see on this is the tweet that is generated, and I'm just going to read it out loud in case it's not clear. I'll be tough and bring our jobs back to the US. Nobody else can do it. Our economy will sing again. It's going to be huge, right? So our system says this is a self-promotion strategy that it has chosen. Obviously, the topic that was chosen in this thing happens to be himself. He has a sort of positive sentiment towards himself.
Sort of.
I'm trying to be as subtle as I can.
I don't think the subtlety.
And what is interesting for our system right now is you can go ahead and let's say you wanted to add a topic. So let's say blooming. So this is the interesting part about this system, right? Not every topic will be picked up by blooming. So one of our ways of like counterbalancing that is like, let us give the voice back to the user. If you're using your human intuition and there is a topic in our belief base that you think is relevant for this, feel free to add that. So this would be like, let's say a NAFTA, so like North America. So that's right here, and boom, it gets added, right? There's a slightly negative sentiment there, but then you can update the tweet. And as you can see, because of the slightly negative sentiment and the sort of like the positive sentiment in the headline, there's sort of a more notion of disagreement. And just to give you a context, self-promotion is like the most positive thing. And it gets more negative as it goes all the way up to deflection. Deflection is sort of like worst. So the user can go out and see like, what each of these means. So like there's a little, oh crap, I can't see it. It's basically a little pop-up says, tests public opinion as to a topic. So preemptive framing offers up a new idea. So what would be interesting here is you can also change the sentiment. So what if the man himself really disliked himself, right? In this scenario, right? Let's say I'm an activist. I really want to find out one day he wakes up and he hates himself, right? And so then I can go back and I can update the tweet. And it's interesting, right? Like, and as you can see, sorry, I just.
That's what the function does.
Yes, right. And this is what you should expect in terms of a deflection. So, and as you saw, like, so there's this traceability aspect as you go through the topics. And we would argue this interpretability aspect in the sense that the user has no idea about the deliberator, the appraiser, all these different modules. I don't think the user really needs to know. And as you saw, we sort of packed up the emotions because we tested it out and we realized like 5 degrees of freedom per topic was getting too overwhelming for people. So we packed it up for positive and negative emotions, which were sort of tied very loosely to the sentiment. All right, so that's the end of the demo. I'm going to go back to the presentation and wrap this up. All right, good. So some context here. So why world leaders? We specifically chose that topic for 2 main reasons. One is, most likely these simulations are likely to be consequential if they are of people of influence in positions of privilege and power. More importantly, though, is the availability of grounded data. Public officials often are required to put their stake on the ground, and there are multiple sources that we can look into and cross-verify information, which is really important of building a robust belief base. No belief base is perfect, but if you have more grounded data, the likelihood of you finding the data increases a lot. So with that in mind, this is where we sort of made the initial claim that as long as there is sort of like verifiable belief-based components of these 4 things, you can use the same model and the same kind of deliberator and transfer this. Some limitations of the system. I think there is this aspect of where the system can force a response whenever there should not be a response. But in this case, it kind of works out for the person we're trying to model. It's also, Bluemix has this aspect of not recognizing certain entities, which sort of gets back to the bias that often exists. There is this, Russia for some reason has very high sentiment in it, and we can't figure that out. So that's why we had to give that perspective of like, can you add a topic? Can you edit this topic? Because we wanted the user to have this voice built into the system. And then the belief-based construction, I think, requires expertise from the qualitative as well as the quantitative side, and it's labor-intensive. In terms of future work, we want to analyze some past tweets right now and produce strategies according to that, so like a little retrospective. Conduct a formal evaluation compared to the quick and dirty one that we have done for this work in progress, and sort of substitute the grammar bit that sort of generates the tweet to a generative module, like a neural net. Because at this point, we already have sort of like traceability interpreted all the way to the end. So we really don't need a grammar at that point. So these are some takeaways and implications. From a technological perspective, I think we have presented a system that reveals the inner workings of the black box Twitter simulated rhetoric space out there. And to our best of our knowledge, we're the first to do so. We exhibit, so this is interesting because the system sort of opens itself up, the boundaries of the system is very clear to you. The limitations are there right in your face. It's not making a claim, I can do this, or hiding behind anything. So there is some built-in evaluation, like people get a sense of like if it's working or not very quickly because of the contextual grounded understanding of the model person in this case. And again, that aspect of like being able to add and update the belief base we felt was very important to give the user some voice in the system. In terms of proactive civic engagement, we tried to make the system as interpretively flexible as possible in terms of design. We wanted this tool to be open-ended and relevant social groups to adopt it and sort of meaning make however they want to. So I can think of a climate change activist who is trying to simulate, let's say, some trade headlines that are coming up that have strong correlations to EPA regulations and like potential responses. And because we are always almost reactive to this person's tweeting behavior, I would have liked to be sort of somewhat proactive in this. And I think this transcends even if you were to model, I don't know, Justin Trudeau, for example. And because the system does not necessarily have an end goal in mind, there is this open cycles of inquiry that the person and the user may have to go through, which we think can catalyze sort of jumping on into unexplored relationships between topics, and thereby sort of create some novel, useful, or surprising understanding between different topics. For instance, for a more complex headline that has multiple topics, it at times gets really intractable, like how this is happening, why is this ticked up? And then when you analyze those pieces, you start to develop like certain new understanding of the phenomenon. So with that in mind, we built this project with this understanding that the processes of a democratic society should not be a black box. I think that was sort of like the motivation. And we felt that, can we come up with a system that at least makes some of it explicit instead of implicit? And we feel that as a result of this, we have added at least some value to the discourse of computationally creative systems within the social justice realm. They say, like, thank you for all the individuals and the institutions for all their help, feedback, and thank you.
Super. Questions?
I have one. You chose an individual whose tweets are often not strongly causally connected to each other. That's a statement, not a question. I know. And so that gives you a really good test bed for single tweets in response to a single thing. Can you think about how this sort of system could be extended to a dialogue or even to a multi-part tweet system? Is this approach applicable there, and if so, how?
I think, so as we say, this, like the subject, our system does respond directly to inputs, and it doesn't maintain this notion of a dialogue per se. However, I think something like this can be easily extended to include a dialogue, or even a conversation between multiple agents, because at the root of the conversation is going to be this notion of a belief or something you believe. That's one of the points of open communication on Twitter, is to express beliefs, right? So what might end up happening is that you have two agents in the conversation are each trying to push their beliefs out and overpower the other side. So that might be something interesting for us to look into for the future.
And to build on to what Chris said, if you think about it, it's like the belief just keeps on updating if there's some notion of a memory in it. And instead of news headlines, you can change the input to a corpus in terms of speeches, in terms of previously reported public statements. For us, it was actually a challenge to model this certain individual because of the sort of more or less erratic nature, because we almost have to force the system to come out with deflection and diversion, when most of the time it was sort of moving on more logically than we thought was plausible for the person. Should take that back. More consistent with the person that was modeled. So it was, I think, like almost like an edge case for us. So like, if this can do it, then we can move forward. And like, Jillian, you had a question.
Yeah, I think related to Kaz's question is the belief base that you have internally consistent? And if it is, then how do you resolve that against evidence that contradicts the belief base, right? In the coding scheme that you did, right? Like you needed to come up with beliefs, but like the individual's beliefs in question are not always consistently presented to the world. And if it's not internally consistent, like, does that matter? Or is it okay if you've got conflicting beliefs within your system, and how does your system deal with that?
Yeah. So the beliefs are constructed they're constructed largely in part from actual tweeting evidence from the president. So since human beings are inconsistent and sometimes they say things that contradict each other, sometimes this kind of thing might be reflected in our system. But usually what happens is, say Donald Trump says something really positive about something and then says something really negative about the same thing. Usually those two things kind of cancel out. So you have like a more neutral statement towards that topic. So usually it's not the case that the same topic is treated differently within our system. It's usually that if the evidence in the tweeting corpus contradicts itself, then it takes a somewhat middle approach.
So I guess, sorry, if I can follow, I guess the specific type of inconsistency I guess I was thinking of was more between beliefs, right? So if, for example, I say like, I like Dan, and I like people who are friends with people I like, and I don't like Anne, and Anne likes Dan, right? Like now you've got this like bizarre internal inconsistency that it sounds like you're not modeling because you're just doing the first order, like this is the belief and like taking it at face value. Is that
so? Each belief has that emotion. So it's an appraisal-based model. So we're also using like between beliefs. There's this notion of a norm that sort of gets at sort of like the distance between each. So if, and this is where the part of the construction of the belief base gets challenging, is we are partially reliant on Bluemix in terms of extracting the sentiment and as well as the entity. And then what we do from that is like, let's say we get per topic, and then we actually push out as many tweets as we can for that topic, for the belief digits that Bluemix have given us, and what we as sort of like between 3 or more qualitative researchers agree if this is true or not. So that's how I think our approach to make it, because it was atomic and everything had a tuple, so the emotion and the appraisal. We felt that if that situation does occur, and it does occur, there is some buffer in the system that sort of gets at the norm, sort of neutralizes, as Chris sort of mentioned, the net effect of that, such that it does not necessarily deviate a lot on the output. And because it doesn't deviate on the output, then the resulting strategy has a larger spread, almost like a swing, where there is some sort of, again, the word is sort of like a buffer, that it's not like, right? It's not finicky, but that's a really great point, because we did see that while we were testing it out, because certain topics would yield a single response, and then like very similar topics would like swing from like self-promotion to deflection.
Hmm.
And it's almost like, and in this case, it's not that unrealistic, but like we didn't want it to be.
Yeah.
So it's almost like you want to grade it out. So we did that. To account for that.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really cool. And the last paper from our presentations section has 9 authors, which is a lot, and is about incorporating sort of narrative arcs into procedural generation and using that for influencing players and people who are observing the system, and looks really neat. And
Do you have the required boundaries?
there were an
Can
astonishing,
be changed.
and there are an astonishing number of dongles there, but at the end of the day, hopefully they'll all go together. Wow. Are we not okay?
Do you
Which,
quick
do
everybody
you
pull
have
out your
wrong
dongle
VG?
collection?
Do you need this one? Yes, I do.
There are an astonishing number of dongles, and there are the wrong ones.
Oh,
Wow. This modern world.
There's so many
What's
issues.
that?
There's so many issues and problems.
There are,
Just
but
technology.
you would think that that would be one we would have solved by now. But then again, we can't solve harder ones either, so.
Yeah.
Okay, hey, here we go. Great,
Thank you.
great. Please go ahead.
All right, so yes, we have many authors on this particular paper. I am in the middle here, Sarah. And I'm representing this team project. So I have been fortunate to work with all of these incredible people and more from the University of California at Santa Cruz. So as part of this team project, we've been building this framework for a serious game generation system. And as many of us know here, serious games can really be useful tools for exploring or learning about new topics. In our paper, we address these 3 major strategies that a serious game might employ to impart ideas. So they are narrative-driven gameplay, themed mini-games, and simulation. And I'll go through each of these in turn. So first, narrative-driven gameplay. So narrative-driven games tend to express ideas by following some kind of narrative arc, or they also might use other kinds of formalized storytelling techniques, tropes. And this strategy can be powerful when applied correctly, because stories are a huge part of who we are. They're a huge part of how we make sense of the world, how we make sense of ourselves, and they can emboss these lasting impressions on our own minds, and even change our behavior. One weakness of purely narrative-driven games, however, is that they don't necessarily involve emergent gameplay. So that can be really crucial for engaging systems thinking. To truly understand a topic, it really helps to be able to examine how entities are interacting and behaving within that domain. Now, in contrast to narrative-driven games, we have themed mini-games, which is an alternative approach. And these kinds of games are typically abstract, they're rule-based, they're 2D. The gameplay entities are usually moving around, maybe colliding with each other, doing the same kinds of things mechanically. But these entities are themed in that, depending on what we're talking about, they may have a certain image or other set of central parameters to match the particular domain that we're using. So with themed mini games, a programmer can easily use the same kind of rules to represent different political spaces or provide commentary. However, themed mini games tend to lack complex progression structures. and as a result, they're not really as deeply engaging, or just as you can't as easily identify perhaps with the characters that are in a certain scene as much as we would in a purely narrative-driven experience. So once the player grasps sort of the main idea established by the game's overall rule system, there's little more to explore than that. So those were two strategies. The final strategy is using simulations. In these kinds of games, we're simulating the domain, and typically this will involve multiple rule systems, often with some kind of economic or resource management. Now, simulation games are excellent at supporting systems thinking, in contrast to what we're used to. And in a simulation, for example, we can usually control parameters about a specific domain. We can see the exact impacts, the exact interactions. We can control all those, and that really helps our understanding of the overall topic. Again, however, they can lack the engagement and the emotional impact of narrative-based play. And the authoring process of these kinds of games can be difficult as well, because each domain that you want to simulate will require these multiple interlocking rule systems, and each of those must be tuned appropriately. So unless you have some very intelligent computationally creative systems, which some people at this conference have, that can be difficult as part of a manual authoring effort. As part of our project, we set out to create a framework that builds upon the strengths of each of these strategies. So our proposed approach is meant to combine the emotional engagement of narrative, the accessibility and the simplicity of themed minigames, and then also the ability to engage in systems thinking that's achieved by simulation games. And the results is kind of similar to a generative version of Molly Industria's Unmanned, which, if you're not familiar, Unmanned is a serious game which is composed of a series of vignettes. And each vignette consists of this manually authored mini game and a dialogue tree over here that you can interact with. You can interact with both sides of the screen. The possibility space of Unmanned is somewhat limited, which means that there's not as much support for systems thinking. So multiple playthroughs of this game don't really reveal too much more information on a second run. In our framework, what we do is we follow the same kind of vignette style arc. So each vignette has a minigame, it has a narrative frame. However, what we do is we dynamically generate and sequence those vignettes. And that helps to support this larger possibility space for the player. It presents opportunities to engage in the systems thinking that we want. And as the vignettes are dynamically generated, we have this potential for player actions to have systemic consequences across the whole game. So in terms of what the system looks like, here's a first diagram, part of it. So shown here are the main components for the minigame generator. So what we're doing is we take as input proceduralist readings, certain aesthetics and meaning and dynamics for the players, and some certain desired experience that we want to achieve. And we then generate mechanics and definitions to describe those readings. So those mechanics are described using answer set programming, or ASP. And then once a full set of these mechanics and definitions has been generated, that they actually need to be compiled into a full game. So that compiling process is accomplished by a JavaScript version of Rensa. So Rensa is a lightweight framework. It helps developers encode and adapt semantic information, semantic representations, in a human readable way. And it's useful if you want to be describing or adapting narrative data, concept relations for a particular domain. Maybe you want to avoid potentially unreliable or unuseful or maybe biased data from large concept libraries. So in this case, Rensa was used to translate ASP into JavaScript code compatible with the Phaser game engine. And then, so the mechanics in the definitions generator combined with Rensa here enable us to generate mini games according to some certain desired experience. We also have a separate engine, the story assembler, which this part of the system is dynamically generating the choice-based narratives. So story assembler constructs the dialogue tree that the player sees. And how it does that is it refers to a library of what we call scene fragments, and then it greedily satisfies what we call wish list items that are essentially desired states of the game. The Rensa framework is here in a tiny part of the diagram again, and what it's doing here is it's used to communicate between the story assembler and the game generator. Essentially, because Rensa is this framework for representing concepts and ideas, it can represent what the story assembler is thinking about, what the game generator is thinking about. So its job in this context is just to ensure that actions taken as part of the minigame affect the narrative frame, and vice versa. Finally, we have one last major component, and that's the narrative sequencer. So this manages the overall experience. It keeps track of the gameplay performance for the player, as well as the narrative choice, and it helps to determine which scenario that the player might be presented with next. And again, that all of this increases the space of possibility for repeated play. So all of these components working together produce a game that marries this kind of narrative-driven theming and simulation gameplay approaches. So now let's look at an example of a game that might be produced from this kind of framework. So we developed a prototype in the domain of climate change. So pictured here is a screenshot of our dialogue tree and our minigame. So the narrative context for this particular scene is that the player is a volunteer activist, and they're helping to relocate animals from one habitat to another. The current habitat is currently being destroyed by climate change. And so in the minigame, what you're doing, you can't really quite see, but what the player has to do is sort of scrub away the screen with their cursor and search for these animals that they need to relocate. And on the left, we have this choice-based narrative, which is a dialogue between the player and a fellow activist. So in this particular scene, you need to continue to keep digging enough of the beach for this dialogue to continue. So this kind of grinding and scrubbing action might be said to be somewhat reminiscent of the tedium or effort of a real job. And the dialogue here requires the player to question whether the actions they're taking are a valuable use of their time. So players are throughout this are sort of given the opportunity to reflect on their attitudes of the issue, to debate with other non-player characters, and to potentially inspire other NPCs. So that's one example scene. We did conduct a very preliminary evaluation of this. 10 participants or so played this prototype. There were three, they played through 3 scenarios like that scene out of 4 possible, so it was a branching narrative with the first 2 were the same, but the third was one of 2 possibilities. And they were asked a range of questions about the gameplay, how it might have influenced them. The participants themselves were college students, and they were all aware of climate change, not necessarily activists in their own lives. And that was a very particular target demographic that actually had a team of advisors suggest that we pursue. So one of the interesting preliminary results we found was actually particular to this scene I just described. So in this scene, you're confronted with this NPC, this non-player character, who doesn't believe in that any of the actions that you're taking are going to help climate change. And a lot of the participants remarked that the characters seemed excessively pessimistic, that it was really hard to tell if they could change his mind, and that led to a frustrating experience. So what we believe that might suggest, although we need to do much more work, many more studies, but we think that in this type of context, it's important for players to see a noticeable effect of their actions in this kind of a high agency system. Overall, the results thus far suggest that participants are not only learning new facts from the game, so they're actually, when we ask them about the game afterwards, they're pointing to things that they've learned, carbon dioxide effects, so this and this. The game also encouraged them to change their behavior in their own lives. And this combination of narrative, choice-driven narrative and gameplay, they all sort of responded positively to. So although we will need to conduct many more studies, there's a lot of confounding variables with this kind of work. These preliminary results indicate that this kind of framework, which is dynamically generating this combination of narrative and mini games, might be effective for teaching and fostering empathy with regards to social justice issues. In the future, we are hoping to conduct a more in-depth evaluation, especially within the domain of climate change. We're also interested in exploring how well this framework might generalize to other social justice causes. And it's generally our approach, I would say that it's generally our hope that this kind of framework might enable more pedagogical experiences that are impactful, while providing this same kind of means for players to more deeply explore and simultaneously understand topic areas. I would like to quickly acknowledge those who have guided our work. So we were fortunate to have a diverse group of advisors that could provide guidance according to their respective specialties. That includes Terry Bruce. She's a professor at Stanford, who was part of the ICCC that won the Nobel Prize back in 2007. And that's pretty much it. But thank you all for your kind attention.
Questions?
So I didn't get a good sense, and this might have been my fault. What all does it take? What all does your system need to be able to make something like the climate change game? So like clearly, writers and artists are up there.
Yes.
So like, what goes in, what comes out? Is sort of what I'm asking.
So what goes in are the proceduralist readings. We have some parameters that represent what kind of experience that goes in for a particular scene. So some things like basically these are kind of like concepts that humans know that our computers don't automatically know. So things like climate change. In the beach scene, we have this idea of scrubbing the sand away, and that's tiresome. Those kinds of ideas. The writers and artists. So the writers are writing sort of story fragments that are being pieced together by the story assembler. The artwork, so these are undergrads who produce artwork. We also had a graduate student who made artwork as well. And those are being combined. So it depends on the particular scene, but we do have, for example, like a themed mini game. We have some entities that might have an image used in a particular context, depending on what the scene is depicting. That makes sense.
I think so.
So we have those kinds of things where we're just kind of slapping on an image onto some kind of entity that has a particular set of mechanics generated by a minigame generator.
Yeah. Okay.
It's cool. So let's imagine that you want to I guess what I see in this system is a way of making pedagogically and perhaps influentially relevant games. What is there anything inherent in it that pushes that towards social justice versus other goals? I mean, could you use the system to try to make the educational system that showed something offensive and lying and use the same techniques for that?
That's a really good question. That's obviously something that we haven't evaluated, but I do think that it could be used for other purposes as well. We made it with the intent in mind to pursue these kind of multiple goals of education and spreading awareness of these kinds of issues.
Right.
But it certainly might be used in other contexts as well.
I mean, I'm just imagining, like, if we were in the Bizarro world, it's the opposite of the room that we're in right now. Would the same people be equally excited about the idea of the Breitbart version of the system that you've built?
I mean, I think so. We can use games however we want.
Right.
They are our medium for some of us.
Sure.
So like the game that I gave in this example of the themed mini games. I think it's called something like Mel Gibson's drinking game. It's not very politically correct. It's an example of a news game that Michael Matthias once used in a paper issue, citation right there. But really, we can use these kinds of technologies however we want them.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. So with that, there's a coffee break, which I think is downstairs. Is that
Yes.
right? Okay, which is downstairs. We're supposed to come back in 15 minutes. Maybe we'll say more like 20.
Yeah.
Like we'll start at 10:40.
Yeah.
Let's go with that.